Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. And today we have the honor of having Kristen Campbell, who is a clinical psychosexual therapist accredited with the Society of Australian Sexologists and has been working as a sex and relationship therapist in her practice on the south coast of New South Wales in Australia. Kristen also teaches for the University of Sydney and holds a passion for women's sexuality and the impact of sexual trauma on sexual well-being.
We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Welcome, Kristen.
Oh, thanks so much.
Yes, it's wonderful to have you here. And I think the first thing I'd love to hear from you is what made you choose this area? Obviously, sex and talking about sex is quite a taboo, and that's what, part of what we're going to be discussing today. And therefore, I love to hear the story of what gets people into working as in sex therapy or talking about sex, especially women's sexuality. Inevitably, it's not the easiest area to go into. So tell us about it.
Right. And which I think is such a good question. And particularly when we are here talking about the taboo of sex, because essentially this is what brought me into sex therapy, of not only my own, personal interest of noticing that there was this thing that everybody's interested in. We see it everywhere. We see it on TV and, people are talking about it growing up, that there's so much that is around sex, but yet nobody feels particularly comfortable talking about it. So it would always feel like this, well, certainly for me, it was like this never-ending quest for information that I could never find out enough about this topic area that felt so important to people. I was professionally trained as a social worker, and my first job as a newly graduated social worker was in a mental health unit, working with people who had, really, really complex and chronic mental illnesses, and a lot of the time were prescribed a team of medications that would inevitably really harm their sexual function and diminish their sexual function. And, we were working in a rehab unit that was supposed to be holistically addressing, the issues that consumers were experiencing in their lives. And as a social worker, I was always naturally interested in relationships that people have in their lives, and particularly people with chronic and complex mental illness. And one of the things that I would consistently find when I was talking with our clients about these issues is that they weren't able to have fulfilling, enjoyable sexual experiences a lot of the time because of the impact of their mental illness and the medications that they were taking. But also nobody was talking about this, that people were often really significantly impaired in this area of their life, but they didn't seem to be any part of the programs that we were offering that were addressing this. We would talk about healthy relationships, and we would be educating around healthy relationships, but we wouldn't be talking about, healthy sexual relationships with yourself and with other. I got curious, and I had heard that sex therapy was a profession. So, that took me on that ongoing quest for information, I guess, wanting to know more.
That's wonderful. And also, how do people relate to you when you say that you're a sex therapist? Have you noticed anything about the way people respond?
Are you very popular at parties?
Yes.
It's one or the other, in terms of you're either the person that people want to talk to, or it is a conversation shut down.
People start backing away.
People start backing away from you and think, oh gosh, like I don't know quite what to say. Or the other thing is that, people always have a friend. They always want to know about their friend who has, such an issue over here, and they always start to tell you about their friend. I think there's usually they're usually the two responses. Either things that, people are interested and that they think that you're just hearing about all of the dirty little secrets of people's lives, along the way. And so they're fascinated by that, and they are curious and they want to know. A lot of the time there's then, a lot of disappointment when they hear that a huge part of my job is talking with everyday people that are experiencing everyday sexual problems, that I'm usually not talking with clients that are out there having, weird and wonderful sex lives. They're actually just trying their hardest to navigate, what we would consider as really kind of, normal, healthy sexual behavior. So, most people are usually curious, and they think that, I must just have it all worked out and have all the answers to things. The other curious, and I think this has changed over the time in my career so far, but certainly, 10 years ago when I first trained in sex therapy, people would confuse it as sex work, and that they would think that I was training to become a sex worker. And so that would definitely shut the conversation down when they had heard, that I was a social worker in this really, standard profession, and all of it a sex worker.
Well, what could be more social than that?
Right. So we would have to have lots of clarifying conversations as what a sex therapist is. And lots of people think that a sex therapist is how they're portrayed in the movies. If you've ever seen the movie, Meet the Fockers, and the sex therapist, mother-in-law and mum, that's in that, Mrs. Fokker. And, she's all about, she's in the yoga pants and right down there in amongst people's bodies, and, all the stereotype of sex therapy. So, yeah, it takes a little while for people to work out that actually it looks just like, any other counseling, psychologist, profession where we're talking to people just particularly about sexual issues. But yeah, I think my parents were probably not so impressed when I initially told them I was studying postgraduate qualifications in sex therapy. But they've come to see the value in that, and certainly in our family, it's changed the culture of how we talk about sex.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, because I think it's fascinating to listen to you and how you navigated it socially, because it is so true, right? We're talking about the taboo, that people do feel uncomfortable talking about sex. And I remember when I first started working in, as a recently graduated, I, didn't talk to individuals about their sex life. That was like a no-go topic. I didn't see it was relevant. And with many of my supervisees, I asked them, do you talk to your clients about their intimacy? And they're like, why? That's not what they brought to the room. And, more and more with my work, I've realized how essential it is, not just for the couples, but the individual, because it's such an important part of the way we relate to others, and also the importance of the quality of our sex life indicates also the quality of our relationship. And having more conversations about it gives us permission for it to be okay to talk about it. And what you shared just reminds me of how much people do actually want to talk about it, because there is an inherent curiosity, but it is, very much veiled with this kind of taboo around inappropriateness or morality, or just not the thing you do. Socially appropriate, really.
So I'm wondering what you could say about how that came about, that it did become a taboo subject. Because I would imagine, this is not an area of mine, but I would imagine that other cultures, other times, it wasn't quite like this.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's first kind of saying what is the taboo of sex, right? In terms of, because we're obviously talking about the taboo of talking about sex, but this is such a layered issue, as far as there is, what we would say is like the mainstream taboo, which is talking about, sex in relationships that we would see as socially acceptable, right? So, if we think about between, men and women, or over time, we're getting a lot of change in the area of feeling more socially accepting of relationships that aren't just between a man and a woman, and when legal adjustments now to that in terms of lots of countries are now legalizing same-sex marriage, and this is then filtering down into society where we can see there's more acceptance of talking about and accepting same-sex relationships and relationships between different people who might identify as different genders. But essentially we then have kind of below that is taboo around talking about things like casual sex or fetishes or sex amongst older adults or amongst people with disabilities. That we kind of we start out in a general discomfort about talking about sex in what we would consider socially acceptable setting for sex, but then we sort of filter down from there to we become more and more uncomfortable talking about sex in all of these different settings, and let alone when we get to things like masturbation, particularly for women, that this becomes again a taboo where we're not supposed to talk about this. This isn't on the dinner party conversation agenda. And so where this has come from, we can trace it back, because there is no one agreed upon place that the taboo of this has come from. All of the different schools will have a different idea. So there's psychological ideas, there's anthropological ideas, there's cultural ideas of where it has come from. And, certainly there is agreement that religion has played a significant role in creating taboo, that there's the rules that religion associate with what's considered socially acceptable sexual behavior, and anything that doesn't fit into that. So for many religions, socially acceptable sexual behavior would be considered penis in vagina sex between a man and a woman who are ideally married. And so anything that doesn't fit into that category becomes what's considered socially unacceptable, and therefore that is where the taboo starts. Because if you're a person who is engaging in sex other than that socially acceptable category, then there is inherent guilt and shame around that, because that is not something that would be encouraged or even spoken about in your community. So there is a really interesting idea around why sex is taboo. And it's because there is, and this comes from the field of cultural anthropology, and there has been studies done in this space of looking at that the idea that humans we have a collective fear of death, right? That we don't want to see ourselves as animals and our eventual demise. And so part of what we do as a species to move away from that fear of death is to see ourselves as more spiritual or evolved than other animals. Sex comes into this, in that sex reminds us that we are in our basic form animals, and that we have these primal urges, primal needs, primal desires, and that actually reminds us of our mortality. So there's an idea that is at its core where it has come from as a species. And then certainly over time, we can layer that with the different institutions and societies that have been created within our species. So, things like power and control and the perpetual quest for power and control, and groups who seek to hold the power and control in society have very much played a role in creating taboo around sex. So, we're all familiar with the patriarchy as a collective. And the idea here is that men hold the power and control in society, and they set the agenda. So we can hold responsibility here as far as, the taboo around women's sexuality, of women needing to be seen as, at home with their children, certainly not as a sexual being, sexually being holding fidelity to one person only. And that this actually kind of frees up, their male partner to not hold themselves to the same standard, because the woman is, at home essentially looking after the camp. So there's all these different, I suppose, ideas around where this comes from. Another one would be, of course, around religion and the rules that, like, we've already spoken about. But then the other part of that is, though, the individuals who are a part of these societal structures can then worsen the guilt and shame that we feel at an individual level. So let's say, for example, in a family, we have a family that really subscribes to religious ideology and rules, that life and their premarital sex, or sex that is not between a man and a woman, penis and vagina sex, would be not considered acceptable. Then if their child, for example, shows signs of what we would say is normal sexual development, so say, for example, a young child touching their penis, or while the parent witnesses that they can then, shame that child for that behavior, and therefore are passing on the individual kind of guilt and shame that child might feel in that very natural urge that they've experienced. So this is, we could say, in social work background, part of what we would see is the different levels of the system. So we've got the micro level, which is that individual level of what happens between individuals. We have the meso level, which is, the groups and societies that we're a part of. And then we've got our macro level, which is the bigger context of our world. And we can see that there's different tactics in terms of maintaining taboo at all those different levels.
And I guess having more and more of these conversations helps us to question our position and to think about what we want to be able to be talking about and why. And as I was thinking about our talk today and the taboo and what is really the taboo, I think the taboo is being able to talk about it, the taboo that we want intimacy, we want sex, that we might have different desires for sex is also a bit of a taboo. I was thinking that, there is a myth that our desire for sex stays across our lifespan. I think there's a taboo around women's desire for sex versus men as well, that it should be different or that it is different. And so having these conversations, being able to break the silence, also gives us permission to ask ourselves these questions. And it begs the question in terms of the quality of any relationship is, how intimate can we really be if we can't be open with our own selves around our sexuality desires? Because if we can't have those conversations internally, it's very difficult to be having them with a partner or with a community where you want to be having this.
Right. And I think, more to that, Emma, is that it's really normal. Both of these things are normal, right? It's normal to want to have a sexual response in your body, or not. It's normal either way. It's also normal to be impacted by all of these different messages that we get. Just because we are impacted doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us, that we haven't been able to hold up, enough of a wall against those messages. Both of these things are normal, and really being able to look at the impact of it, that if you have noticed that through your life, when different things have happened around your sexual development, if part of the response that you're feeling to that is shame, that is not something that we would feel without the influence of these structures and of these parts of our macro system. Yes. Right? And it's quite similar to, say, when we talk about body image, of when we look in a mirror and critique our body, these are not thoughts that we would have at a biological level. These are thoughts that are created from being in the world that we live in. That wouldn't be there if we didn't have the messages sent to us that we have, around what our bodies should be like. And this extends into sex. I mean, it can be such a separate area, but this is the same for sex, that if we had grown up, and somehow managed to be unaffected by the world that we live in, this wouldn't be a thing. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about this on a podcast, because it would just be a fundamental part of our daily life, much like, toileting is. That we're not talking about a podcast on toileting, right? Because it's just an accepted part of our bodies. It's something that we all know and know each other do, and we don't need to, question that or talk about that. There's no specific messages that we're sent around, how we should toilet.
I don't know. I think a podcast on toileting might be interesting. Well, we'll have to think about that. We'll get back to you on that. We have to find an expert in that first.
Find some expert. Exactly. But yeah, I think that's kind of, a huge part of this, is that all of this does come from this bigger world that we live in. And what it actually looks like for individuals is, we have our emotional, our psychological impact in terms of guilt and shame. It can look like confusion. It can look like a lack of confidence. It can look like criticism and judgment of yourself for how your body responds, or things that you like, or perhaps what you dislike. It can look like disgust in response to different aspects of sex or bodies or sexuality. And it can look like not talking about sex and sexuality with a partner or with anybody else. And, it can look like all of these things. There's also a part of taboo, just to kind of take a little right hand, in terms of one of the common threads of the background of where this taboo has come from is a sense of danger, right? So, one of the things that religion has offered the world is some social order, right? In terms of, when our species became more involved and resources became scarcer because there was more of us, then, we needed some structure in society for society to be able to function. That we couldn't be just going around and having dozens of children that couldn't be supported, because, the society as a whole would not have functioned. So, sex all of a sudden became dangerous because of the risks, associated with having children that you couldn't support. And if we could say that that's one of the places that the taboo has come from, we also still have taboo around things like child sexual abuse, bestiality, incest, non-consensual sex between adults. All of these things still have the element of danger, that we still have issues around safety, for the people who are victims of those behaviors. And taboo still serves in that way, as far as it helps us to not understand what is right and wrong, right, to a degree. But the way that it doesn't serve us is that it usually comes along with silence. And this actually benefits those who use sex as a weapon, in their world. So certainly it's okay to see that, yes, there's part of it that actually helps us as a society to know, things that are right and things that are wrong, and helps us to function in a way. We need to have boundaries to know what would feel acceptable, but it's the silence that actually goes along with the taboo that causes us, issue, whether it is at an individual level when we're talking about normal, healthy sexual behavior and sexuality, or when we're talking about those who are using sex as a crime, that they use silence as a means to be able to continue with their behavior.
Absolutely. And I was thinking about, the lack of conversation around sex is dangerous, because it means that certain individuals may not know that what is happening is wrong. So especially young people or even children, there's the research to back this up, that the more they know about sex, the less likely they are to be a victim of a sort of molestation or, sexual abuse. And the same goes for adults. If they haven't been exposed to enough conversations about what they would consent to or what they wouldn't, they might find themselves in very tricky situations and then feel very ashamed to talk about it. Absolutely. Having these open conversations is a protective factor. And the younger, the better, even though it's still a huge contention. I know, in Singapore, we have a very multicultural community, and talking about sex in schools, parents have to consent to whether they have sex education classes, and their children can opt out because the different communities, some of them find it very, very uncomfortable and inappropriate to be talking about sex with, I think our school started at the age of, I think it was 9 or 10, which you could say is a bit late in some ways, because they should be talking about, certainly about body parts and the act of sex even younger, so that children are aware of what's appropriate and what's not, and how to talk about it and not to hold secrets. All these things are really protective, but because of the taboo and the fears around talking about sex, and I think with children and young people, there's a fear that you'll give them ideas or that somehow they'll think about doing it, although they have the curiosity naturally anyway. We don't, doesn't add to that curiosity, but there's certainly, not enough conversations happening, and that does create a level of risk for young people, but also for adults, and not just in terms of getting themselves in situations that could be dangerous, but also reduces the likelihood of them reaching out, can increase the trauma because of the shame that is attached to it as well. Yeah, it has a huge impact.
Absolutely.
Here in the States, this has become a hugely political issue, and it's become quite the cause amongst, very conservative, religious conservative pockets, entities, whole states within our country. And it's specifically gone after, this idea of what children ought to be able to learn in school. And I think we've always had, a lot of parental consent around sex education in the United States, and that varies from region to region, but now it's really becoming quite discouraging with all the book bans and, scouring libraries for anything that might be suggestive of some of that stuff. It isn't just, man, woman, keep the lights out, don't enjoy it, procreate.
Right. That's right. Because I think you can still see, sometimes when we talk about the history around this, we think it is history, right? In terms of somehow we've progressed enough that we can, critically analyze all of these messages that we receive in society, but that's absolutely not the case. And I think, that can feel really obvious in the States at the moment in terms of some of those structures that have held so much influence in this space are still very much current and influential.
Yeah.
And look, I think that it's not. I'm in Australia, I suppose, where we still have those influences and structures, of course. But I was consented for my 6-year-old learning about relationships in their PDE health, curriculum just last week. And I thought, I'm not being consented around what he's learning in mathematics or English. He's 6, and at this point in time, they're learning about body parts. And I thought, oh my goodness, my children could probably teach the curriculum on that to their peers at this point. That my friends often joke, they know all the names of their body parts, correct terminology, because it is, to me, that is so important. I want them to understand, what their body parts are. These are their bodies, and they should have that information. And we need to be promoting bodily autonomy to be able to prevent, some of the ways that people can use sex as a weapon. This isn't just about how, consensual adults enjoy their sexual relationship. That's one aspect of it. But certainly how we support our kids in navigating those who might want to harm them in a sexual way. To me, that's actually more important, to be able to arm them with information and support them to understand through that they do have bodily autonomy, and you know, what they can do with that when they grow up, and the pleasure that they can find in that is one aspect, but also how they, you know, how they can, you know, act protectively for their bodies, and also to be protective of other people's bodies.
It's funny, it's how subtle some of the conversations around consent and lack of consent can happen. I remember years ago, we were watching Sleeping Beauty, and my son, my eldest, was probably 10. And we were watching it with, obviously, my daughter was the one that was most interested in it. Again, very gendered, but they were watching it too. And obviously, at the end, the prince kisses Sleeping Beauty.
Mm.
And my boy said, "Is that consenting? Because she's asleep." And I thought, wow, you're absolutely right. That's not consenting. And then we went back and we looked at Snow White, and the same thing happens with Snow White. And all these kind of stories, right? They're fairy tales. Nobody stops and thinks about it.
Right.
He was right. Neither of them were consenting. So then we had this big conversation, and my daughter was very disappointed with the fact that it got deflected from this picture sort of beauty and waking up and being saved by the prince. And it became a conversation around how inappropriate that is.
Right.
Happening.
Right.
But it's so subtle.
But it's insidious, right? In terms of these seemingly innocent, you know, Beauty and the Beast is another one. And I often have conversations with my kids when they're interested and they're watching that about, you know, how the Beast is actually displaying a really obvious pattern of coercive control for Belle, right? And that this is something that our children are watching from a very, very young age. It's part of this messaging that starts so young, you know, that it's no wonder that by the time many people get to adulthood, where you know, there is an expectation to have a sexual relationship, you know, that then they're a bit stuck and they don't quite know what to do with themselves at that point, and then are often needing to seek help. Which I think brings us to, you know, a really good point. We've already touched on it in terms of formal education, you know, that our children can be receiving through school. But this is true for adults. Most of us as adults haven't had, you know, great sex education, and this is a way, you know, that we disrupt some of this silence and taboo around sex, is to educate ourselves, you know, to be able to learn about what's the history of some of this and look at it critically, you know, of who has benefited from these messages over time. And certainly, like I was saying, one part of it will be that individuals and societies have received some benefit, but, you know, mostly the benefit will go to those who have sat in powerful positions, you know, and have held influence over society. So, you know, part of what we can do is start to look at educating yourself as an adult in terms of, you know, what even is normal sexual behavior? What is healthy sexual behavior? What does that actually look like? You know, what are some of the things that promote, you know, pleasure in the body and with yourself and with a partner? There's some wonderful resources in this space now, and, you know, I'm a huge fan of Emily Nagoski, you know, from the States, and she has wonderful resources that I share with all of my clients. You know, particularly she has a book called Come As You Are. There's a podcast by the same name, and her website has some fantastic resources, including worksheets that help you to be able to, you know, prompt through some of the ideas that you might hold around sex, and reflecting on sexual behavior that has felt, you know, good and pleasant, and also that has felt not so good in the space of the kids as well.
I was just thinking that what feels good and what doesn't feel good, and how important it is to have those open conversations, but how inadequate most of us feel in having those conversations with ourselves and our partners. And the lack of those conversations leads to this dissatisfaction in a very important area of our life. And I think some of the curiosity that we often hear from people, you know, talking about sex feels a little bit immoral or a bit dirty. Some people think it's a bit titillating, but that kind of reminds me of it being such an area of interest to all of us. And that's why it feels important to be having more open conversations, because ultimately we all want to have a sexual relationship which is satisfying. And also there's some people who don't, and that's also okay.
Mm.
I think it goes both ways, that some, individuals that I've come across that don't have an interest in sex and feel ashamed about that and feel that that's wrong. And it is complicated if they're in a partnership with somebody who does. And how to navigate that is a completely other sort of conversation. But
Right.
the more we're able to have these conversations, the more it becomes we have permission to be curious, to explore, to understand our needs, what we like, what we don't like, what we can do about it in the relationships that we have.
Right. And how to stand in your own space, right? In terms of, just as much as there's a taboo around, having a healthy sexual relationship with yourself or with others, there's just as much of a taboo if that's not something that feels important to you. And I think that the sexually and gender diverse community is doing such wonderful work in this area of drawing the attention to the broad range of normal human sexual expression, which means that, asexuality is also on that spectrum of what is considered normal, human sexual expression. And there's such good information in that space now of being able to look at that range of diversity and be able to find something that you might identify with and that feels like it fits you.
It just struck me. I mean, I wonder if we could get rid of the word normal, because that does become so categorical, and who decides? Maybe, I don't know, healthy would be an alternative. I don't know.
Right.
For some people, getting a hug is like really nice, and for some people it's very aversive. And so I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest questions that we in the sex therapy field are asked is what is normal? And I suppose the standard answer to that is that there really is no such thing as normal. It's what is normal for the person, right? In terms of what feels like it fits them and what feels right for them, however that looks. So I suppose the issue with it is that, what is considered healthy. It could be the same. It could be the same criticism, right? Because we're still impacted by these messages of what is considered healthy and who decides what is healthy, right? So it really is trying to come back to the individual in terms of what feels good for them, what brings satisfaction, what brings a sense of pleasure, of being in their bodies, and how do we find more of that?
Yes. And I guess that piece around, pleasure being important to everybody. And there's something about that feels a bit immoral. Open conversation about that's just usually a fact. And pleasure comes in many ways. If somebody is asexual, they may get a lot of pleasure from touch, but it's not sexual touch. But, some people may need a lot of touch and need a lot of intimacy and a lot of sex. And I think that being able to have the conversation means that, we get permission to want pleasure. And what pleasure means for each of us is very different. And I was thinking just briefly, like as we sort of come towards the end of our very precious time with you, Kristen, I was thinking about sort of the takeaways that we can give our listeners. So obviously, we've navigated a bit about the history of the taboo and what it means and why it's there and it continues to be there and the risks that are there as a result, and also the impact that it can have on our relationships if we continue to have difficulties talking about it. And I guess there's a lot of myth busting, I think, behind these taboos as well around, like you said, what is normal, what is healthy. I was thinking also about, desire versus arousal, how that's quite, there's a bit of myth around how, some people are more responsive. Like they'll get aroused very quickly, for example, and for them it's quite easy. While some people, so it's more sort of spontaneous is the word, not a responsive. Spontaneous versus some people need more time. And so I think having more conversations will allow us to open up to these different myths and getting to know each and every one of us and what we need to have the intimacy that we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it is, step number one is to educate yourself, right? Of not kind of relying on that happening, through any other external source, is to seek that information out yourself, that there is really good information available to us at this point in history, right? So we have all of the Emily Nagoskis and, the Esther Perels and all of those wonderful leaders in this space who have a platform and we're able to access their resources and be able to educate ourselves. And that then can then lead into being able to develop your own values of saying, now that I understand where the messages and the beliefs have come from, what would I like my values to be? What would be considered normal for me? What would feel healthy for me? And being able to craft that and create those values yourself so that then helps to be able to guide and direct into what you need to do next. Nice. To be able to then create some valued action, of turning that into the behavior that comes into your life.
So would you say the conversation starts with yourself?
Yeah, I really would, in terms of, things like formal education at school. That's part of the picture, right? That's part of how we give our children information. But for adults, nobody's going to give us that information, that we have to seek that ourselves. And whether we do that through, self-directed research online, of starting with a Google search, starting with a, generative AI search of some of the starting places of where this might be, and, educate yourself first, because through that comes confidence to be able to bring it up, with those who are important in your life that you feel like you would be able to have this conversation with. And, part of that can also be accessing some therapy. If you find that through that self-directed learning that there's things that you're unable to navigate or that you're getting stuck on or caught on, this is where there are sex therapy services available, that you can access. And again, part of recent events in our history have enabled accessibility to that you can access sex therapy through online telehealth appointments from anywhere in the world now. That is accessible for many, many people. So that's a resource that's there to be used and to help to guide.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kristen, for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me. Always lovely to talk about it.
Yes. And we've, started chipping away at that taboo together today.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Life's Dirty Little Secrets. For some legitimate, honest, and accurate information about human sexuality, we have included links and resources mentioned in this episode in the show notes. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.